Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, get comfortable and relax.
Tom went mad, Gilbert said. Schizophrenia or something, I think. He stopped leaving the place completely. After a month of being pent up inside, he died of starvation. He was a hoarder, a serious one. It took weeks to get the home cleaned up, and even then there's still some junk in the basement the cleaners left there. I'd be curious to have a look and see if there's anything valuable. He snorted. I doubt it, though. I sorted through what remained of the clutter and determined most of it to be worthless. There were shelves full of dusty tools and stacks of used furniture. Shoved up against the wall was a large mattress with dirty stained sheets and old clothes piled on top of it. There was one thing I uncovered which did catch my attention. In the far back corner of the basement, something was hidden underneath a white sheet. A chest, turned back to face the wall. Within the chest, I discovered a diary and a stack of paintings. I skimmed through the diary first. Below, I've copied out some of the stranger entries as I read them. I had one of the oddest experiences of my life today. It started with a dream. From what I could recall, I was fleeing from something. I don't remember what it looked like. I know it was huge, on a cosmic scale, and it wasn't supposed to exist. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but describing the thing at all is difficult for me. I woke up from the dream with my head throbbing and sweat covering my body. My throat was dry and raw. My ears were ringing. Something felt wrong. When I went outside the following morning, what I saw was bizarre. It looked like a bolt of lightning had struck the ground at the edge of the stretch of hayfields extending past my backyard. The immediate section of corn was blackened and withered, the corn further out a sickly brown color. In the center of the circle of scorched earth sat a hand-sized stone totem. 4 uncanny faces decorated each of its sides. They appeared almost, but not quite human. 2 were screaming, the other 2 bore grins which extended unnaturally wide. The piece of stone was stained on one side with a blotch of reddish-brown. The previous homeowner took the totem back to his house and put it in the basement. The next couple of entries deliberated over various other aspects of his life. I was intrigued enough to keep skimming through the diary, and my curiosity was soon rewarded. Something happened to one of my paintings. I'm writing this down to help me understand it. I have owned the painting for years. It has been here since before my parents moved in. It's the type of thing you live with for such a long time you never really notice it. Yet now, every time I sit in the room with it, I swear I can feel the painting watching me. He went on to describe the painting. An old man sitting on a table with a walking stick in one hand, the other holding a pair of spectacles up to his eyes. When he had examined it closer, Tom noticed something about the painting had changed. The man looks different. He looks scared, and there's a long, tall shadow in the shadows behind him, only barely visible, but it's definitely there. After a couple days, I took it off the wall and put it away in the basement. That was when I noticed the idol had fallen off the shelf it had been sitting on. It has shattered into several pieces. The idol no longer gave off the sense of malice it did when I found it. But that's not to say the feeling has gone. It hasn't. I went back down to the basement. I checked on both the remains of the idol and the watercolor painting. I previously described my discomfort being around the portrait of the old man, but that instinct is gone now. The painting itself appears normal again. Just an old man staring at the viewer with an expression suggesting him to be deep in thought. Upstairs, I have a couple of other portraits hanging up around my house. One is of a little waterfall in a forest. Now out of the corner of my eye, I swear I can see something staring out at me from in between 2 trees within the painting. I thought it had to be my imagination, but when I succumbed to paranoia and took a closer look, I realized it wasn't. When I peered close enough, I caught the shadow of something tall in the trees, hunched over to the side at an odd and unnatural angle. More of the portraits in my house have been changed. These changes are both subtle and unnerving. What is stranger is that when one painting changes, the others change back. The shadow of the thing inside the waterfall painting has disappeared. I want to know if what is going on here can be explained rationally. And if it can't, I want to understand what the hell this thing is haunting me. I've thought about it, and I believe getting rid of the remains would be wisest. I can't emphasize enough how uncomfortable it is to share a house with it. The thing possessing my paintings, which must be somehow connected to the fetish. I hate being around the paintings once they've changed. They're not so bad after they've changed back, but whichever painting possesses the visual anomalies feels alive. Not just alive, but hostile. I honestly feel like the thing inside the paintings despises me. I'm not overly superstitious, but I'd be an idiot to deny there was something evil about the idol I discovered out there. Getting rid of the idol didn't work. Getting rid of all of the paintings I've spotted changes in didn't work. It keeps switching between other portraits all around the house. The most recent one it took possession of is a landscape portrait of a small, old-fashioned neighborhood from the 1930s. Something is staring out at me through one window, no more than a hazy blur in the grayness of the glass. I took it down and put it away with the other ones. The following entries described how it moved from one image to another. Tom subsequently developed a phobia of being around portraits and avoided them religiously, going as far as to lock every painting he owned away in his basement. His entries became less and less coherent. He discussed how his world was falling apart. The account he wrote painted a sad picture of a depressed and lonely man who needed help but didn't know how or where to get it. I could hardly make sense of the last couple entries. They read like the ramblings of a madman. I wasn't surprised since Gilbert told me he'd been diagnosed with multiple mental illnesses in the years leading up to his death. Tom scoured his house repeatedly looking for paintings. He claimed to discover different pictures hanging off of his walls every couple of weeks. It became a daily ritual to check his house to make sure no new ones had appeared. He was convinced something awful would happen if the wraith, as he had begun calling it, was left outside of his basement for too long. This was where the readable part of the journal ended. The remaining entries were impossible to make sense of. I took the journal upstairs and sorted through the paintings. They were the same ones the author described. The one at the bottom of the pile was a depiction of a procession of gaunt soldiers from what looked to be World War II, trudging over the remains of a weathered battleground. The soldiers' eyes were fearful and haunted, their faces stark white. This photo scared me in an inexplicable way. The longer I looked at it, the more mad and deranged the faces of the soldiers appeared. The sensation I felt while around it mirrored the one the author had described, a steadily growing sense of uneasiness which made it difficult to gaze upon the painting for too long. One of the first things I did with the portrait was take a photo of it on my phone. Tom had done the same thing a couple of times previously and made a dubious claim. According to him, the effects the portrait had on him didn't extend to photos of it, no matter how many he took. He was right. The portrait looked distinctly different on camera. The faces of the soldiers appeared more grim rather than haunted, and the one furthest to the back of the procession wasn't grinning in a deranged way the way he was in the original picture. I took a couple more photographs, still not quite able to believe it, but they all showed the same thing. At a housewarming party, I showed the war portrait to some friends. They each shared my discomfort when they looked at it. Some of them didn't get the feeling of dread I described immediately, but one by one they each succumbed to it. When I showed them the photos, they confirmed the differences I noticed were real. They complimented me on my photo editing skills, and I had to explain to them that I didn't do any of this. When I proved the fact by taking another photograph, one of my friends came up with an interesting theory. He suggested a special kind of paint could have been used to make the painting appear different in the light of the camera as a picture was being taken. Keen to get to the bottom of the mystery, I began testing some of the other claims made by Tom in his diary. I placed the World War II portrait next to a collection of creepy photos I'd found online and printed out. The first time it happened was with a photo of a pale, angular face leering out of a dark background. I couldn't say precisely when it occurred, but the wraith took possession of the photo. What had once been a piece of paper with a generic scary image printed on it was now a dark, almost oppressive presence lying on my desk beside me. Something else happened too. The WW2 portrait changed subtly. The soldiers' faces now looked like they did in the photos I took of the portrait. It worked just as Tom had described in his journal. Linked with this post are two of the images it attached itself to. The following picture is the second one the wraith found its way into as a result of my experimentation with it. Whenever I wasn't looking directly at the second photo, I could swear the face had turned around to stare at me directly. I frequently looked to check this wasn't the case, but this did little to curb my anxiety. The effect of the photos seemed to be cumulative over time, the longer the wraith inhabited one photograph. It began as a persistent and intrusive feeling of uneasiness. The longer I spent around the photographs, the more they troubled me. The white, angular face began showing up in the corner of my eye. I began to understand why Tom spoke of the portraits the way he did, and why he hid so many of them away in the basement. If I shared the same room as the wraith, I couldn't bring myself to remain turned away from it for too long, or to look at it for too long either. And I wasn't the only one who felt that way. My friends all shared the same sentiment. Once we played a game to see who could look at one of the possessed photos for the longest. The best of us lasted 9 minutes before shuddering, turning away and leaving the room. There were things the wraith could do, which Tom never learned about. But I did. All of what I'd seen so far was only the beginning of what the wraith was capable of. One rainy day when I was stuck on a class assignment, I elected to take a break and went out to get a coffee. When I came back, I noticed something looking back at me from my computer screen which hadn't been there before. It didn't take me long to pick out the subtle differences in the photo on my screen and deduce what had happened. The wraith had transferred itself onto my computer. What I was looking at was a digital copy of the same leering face I showed you earlier. No copy I made of the image file replicated the cognitive effects of the possessed image, or the visual differences the wraith had made to it. Modifying the image itself didn't do anything at first. When I changed it too much, the wraith abandoned the image and reattached itself to another one in the same folder. I put another image into a parent directory, deleted the possessed one, and waited for a response. I didn't have to wait long. The wraith did what I'd predicted it would do, moving to the image in the other directory. A couple of days later, I managed to get it inside of a GIF. The image depicted a girl standing and staring at her reflection. The animated loop was of the reflection leaning forward and beginning to push its face into the other side of the mirror. The wraith added an extra second to the end of the GIF, showing the reflection melting through the glass on the girl's side of the mirror while reaching out for her. This difference was disturbing enough on its own, but I could have sworn the GIF was changing a little more each time it played on my screen. From time to time, the GIF would pop up on screen unprompted, stuck in its ceaseless repetition. I began to feel a vague sense of dread while using my computer as I feared another occurrence of the wraith flashing up on my screen. It was a stupid thing to be scared of, but I struggled to shake the feeling off. Recently, I'd watched a slasher flick and I decided to see if the Wraith would interact with it. Like with the other media, there were tangible differences in the possessed version of the film. The murder scenes were more graphic and lasted longer. The movie concluded with a 10-second shot of the murderer staring into the camera expressionlessly with no music or noise. Upon watching the movie for a second time, several more scenes played out where various characters stopped, fell silent, and stared into the screen as the murderer had done. The movie mutated further each time I watched it. Scenes became glitched, and the subtitles turned into an incomprehensible jumble of characters from a language I couldn't identify. After showing the movie to my friends, they were as unable as I was to explain what they saw. They had seen enough to be convinced the Wraith was real, even if I wasn't so sure of the fact myself. However, none of us were scared by the idea. We were fascinated. We were debating what it meant when one of them brought up an intriguing suggestion. This little group of ours was in the middle of working on a horror game. It was a passion project the five of us, George, me, Nick, Hayden, and Matthew, had envisioned during our first year together at college. The Wraith can inhabit all kinds of media, George said, leaning in. What if it could inhabit a video game? At his urging, I moved the possessed movie file into the game folder on my computer. When this didn't have an effect, I deleted the file the Wraith had possessed. It turned up in an image file again, this time a texture within the game. The game we were working on was an exploration of a large, liminal landscape. There was little story or background, just wandering through an eerie world with an atmosphere inspired by titles ranging from the old Silent Hill games to Active Worlds. Even though little in the game had been tangibly changed, playing it was a totally different experience. There was an unshakable sense something was hidden in the game with us, something which wasn't supposed to be there. George, in particular, was blown away by what the game had become. He got it into his head that we had to find a way to put the Wraith into all copies of the game. Then, we would release the game, and everyone would get to experience what we did while playing it. He was certain it would be a massive success if we could achieve this. He went as far as to claim it might end up being one of the most successful indie horror titles of all time. I brought up the significant issue with his plan. There could only be a single copy of the haunted game. My friends could only experience the game like I did when they played it on my computer. Streaming or otherwise recording the game couldn't effectively recapture the effect playing it had. He suggested running the game files through a special program to create duplicates of the Wraith. Though it seemed like a dubious prospect to me, I agreed to transfer the file onto a USB drive to give to him. He was convinced he could pull it off, and his excitement at the idea was contagious. For the next couple of months, George dedicated himself to development of the game. The work he did during this time was impressive. In one live stream, he toured us through a life-sized sports stadium and a fully furnished shopping mall. He wanted the experience of the game to be unique for everyone who played it. For this, he had decided to make the world procedurally generated. It was an overly ambitious goal, but George was adamant he could pull it off, and he already had the code to prove it. The progress he'd made was great, but it wasn't what we cared about. We wanted to hear about what he'd done with the Wraith. George admitted he was struggling to control the thing. It was skipping through files in the game too fast for him to keep track of. He assured us he would get on top of the issue and fulfill his promise. We just needed to be patient. George was a binge worker. He was typically either procrastinating or feverishly working on something. We were used to seeing him worn out after staying up late completing an assignment the night before it was due. I bring this up to explain why we weren't initially concerned when we noticed the way George looked during classes. We did get a bit worried when he started skipping classes and missed a pair of exams. That concern evolved into worry when Nick overheard he'd bailed out on a family reunion. We reached out to him. He admitted his insomnia had come back. He tried to play it all off like it wasn't a big deal, and promised us he intended to see a doctor. 2 weeks later, George shared with us another milestone in the game's development. The Stalker was a new idea George had added into the game. It would come out after a certain amount of time had elapsed in-game. The Stalker was supposed to be a physical manifestation of the feeling of something hidden just behind every corner and lurking beyond the walls of fog that the Wraith elicited. We were a little peeved he'd updated the game in such a major way without consulting with any of us. We might have argued about it, however, George was the lead developer of the game and currently the only one working on it at the time. Over the course of the 2-hour live stream, he wandered the empty landscapes of the game searching for the Stalker, and we sat watching him. For the first 30 minutes, he traversed a metropolis full of stone-still figures staring out of windows from buildings rising unnaturally far into the sky. He wandered around a town square with an oversized circular fountain where every building was obscured by a dense layer of stagnant mist. The creepy atmosphere of the game was offset by banter between us as we watched him play. Yet there was only so long we could fill the void of silence as George roamed restlessly around the empty world. He remained uncomfortably quiet, hardly responding to our attempts to start a conversation, and he became more irritable each time we tried to talk to him. "I think I see it," George announced over the live stream suddenly. I didn't see anything. Neither did any of the other viewers who were still tuned in. His avatar had stopped and was staring off toward the slope of a hill upon which a single, lonely skyscraper rose into the sky. His next comment came after another minute of silence. "I keep walking toward this thing, but it doesn't seem like I'm getting any closer. It has turned around, I think." His avatar wasn't moving at all. He hadn't moved since he claimed to have seen the Stalker. There was another pause. "You see it, don't you?" We all agreed that we could see nothing. "I see its face." "Bloody hell, there's something wrong with it. It's..." The live stream continued for a while with George's avatar staring off into the depths of the gray gloom. We didn't hear another word from him. After a full day of no contact from George, I went over to his place to check on him in person. George laughed his behavior off, telling me he'd felt a little sick and decided to take a break. He refused to acknowledge how strangely he'd been acting during the live stream. He couldn't remember seeing the Stalker at all, and he couldn't remember how the live stream ended. Following this incident, George began to deteriorate more rapidly. His insomnia got worse. You could see signs of it whenever he bothered attending class. He started nodding off frequently. He was always staring off into space with a dull look in his eyes, hardly acknowledging the world going on around him. George had started a blog a year prior as a game dev diary to keep the small community of fans the game had attracted up to date on its progress. By that time, it had become the main way he communicated with the outside world. I'm sorry for all the delays in releasing the alpha. Development has been complicated by bugs and some other personal issues going on in my life. A lot of you have been asking, who is the Stalker? I've been thinking about this a lot recently, deliberating over whether it's better to leave it a mystery for the player to imagine, or if I should give a backstory to uncover as they explore. I would appreciate your input on this. I'm hoping to release an update to the demo to show off some of the new stuff I've patched in. I'm looking for playtesters. Tell me you hate the game if you want. I just want to hear some honest input from people. I had a dream last night. In the dream, I was wandering around in circles inside a city. It soon dawned on me that I was stuck inside the game. The Stalker was there. It took off its face as if it were some kind of mask. What I saw after that frightened me enough to run like hell away from it. I wish I could tell you what it was I saw, but all I can recall is a haze. I kept running until I couldn't anymore. When I stopped and checked behind me, the Stalker was gone. Then somehow, I was back where I began my journey. I started to walk again for whatever reason. As is the case many times in dreams, I was unable to control my own actions. Later, I found myself at the tall building where I first saw the stalker, and the events of the dream repeated themselves. I was confronted with the entity again. It took off its face, and I saw what lay beneath, and I ran in terror. This cycle repeated over and over. Each time the entity revealed itself as something horrifying, though once again, I can't remember its appearance. I couldn't tell you if it had a different face each time, or the same one. The dream lasted an uncomfortably long time. It was longer than any other dream I've ever had. When I woke up from it, I felt as exhausted as if I had spent the whole night awake. I have these dreams every night. They last so long and they seem too real. When I wake up from them, I feel as if I haven't slept at all. I find it increasingly difficult to focus during the day, and I've become accustomed to feeling maddeningly tired all the time. I didn't know it was possible to want to sleep so badly, and yet find it so bloody hard to get any proper rest. The sleeping pills aren't working anymore. I take them anyway. I'm very dependent on them, and I don't have the energy to deal with the side effects of quitting. At least they make me feel a little less crappy for a while. Weeks passed before another update was made. I think there were a pair of deleted posts written during the period, but I couldn't recover them. Here is the last thing he ever posted. Hi everyone. I need to focus on my mental health for a while. I will be pausing work on game development for now. I'm sorry for all of you who expected a release soon. I can't say when an alpha is going to arrive, or if I'm ever going to pick up this game again, to be honest. For anyone still tuned in, this is goodbye. For now. We'd had a talk with him and finally gotten George to understand how seriously he needed help. He'd been persuaded to speak to a new doctor about his sleep issues, and he came back with a new prescription. He also acknowledged how obsessed he had become with the game and agreed to take a break from working on it. He was still in a bad state, but he'd taken the first steps in getting his life back together. I made a mistake then, though I didn't realize it at the time. I allowed George to keep the possessed copy of the game. As long as the wraith remained in his life, its grip on his mind would never loosen. Not understanding that truth cost George everything. A couple of days after our last exchange, George was found dead in his apartment. It was a seizure, the doctors said. The seizure caused apnea, which was what caused his sudden death. The scene must have been traumatizing for his mother, who discovered him in his apartment. When she'd found him, he was lying on the floor. The room was dark except for the flickering light of his computer. It was locked on the game world. George was spread-eagled. His face turned to the side and one of his arms was dislocated. It felt like so little time ago that I was hanging out at George's place with a pile of pizzas and some drinks, and we were laughing at some silly game he'd created over the weekend for a game jam. The George I remembered was a totally different person from the haggard and mottled skeleton of a person we saw at the funeral. The game was abandoned. After a couple months passed, we began working on a new project together, but without George there to guide and motivate us, it lacked the passion and drive it needed to get anywhere. Soon enough, we abandoned it too. As for the wraith, it sat untouched within an unidentified file on George's computer for a while. His home remained undisturbed for close to a year. George's mother eventually decided to clean up the apartment. She asked us if there was anything of his we wanted to keep. After some deliberation, I agreed to be the one to go back there to retrieve his computer containing the possessed copy of the game. My friends and I replayed the game to make sure the wraith hadn't moved again. Once we agreed that it was still inhabiting the game, we deliberated on what to do with it. We decided we couldn't dispose of the computer. The wraith would transfer itself to another conduit, and with the new item it would prey on someone else. Perhaps another one of us. After some debate, we agreed to have it sealed away instead. We hoped it might remain inactive if it was isolated from people as it had been before I moved into the house. Nick rented out a storage unit. We locked the hard drive of the computer in a safe box and we left it there. We hoped to never have to lay eyes on it again. For a couple of years, our plan actually worked. Nothing could replace the piece of our lives the Wraith had stolen, but at least now we knew it wouldn't hurt anyone else. Things were complicated when the storage space was robbed. Nothing was stolen from the unit we'd rented, but the one next door was completely trashed. Nick elected to move the safe box and its contents to a new, more secure location. Just in case, he said. Somewhere along the journey moving it, I believe the Wraith abandoned the hard drive and attached itself to something in Nick's car. From there, it followed him home and silently slipped into his life. We didn't figure out this had happened until much later. Since graduating college, Nick had become a successful voice actor. He found roles in some video games and a couple of minor TV shows. Nick was also an aspiring ventriloquist, something he picked up from his father. His father had been a semi-popular ventriloquist during his time, and Nick liked to talk about continuing his legacy. It should be noted, Nick had never been great at ventriloquism. He was convinced he was good at it, but he really wasn't. He loved doing acts on stage, but very few could sit through the performances and feel entertained the way he entertained himself. He had a very off-brand kind of humor that only he seemed to understand, and he didn't take criticism of his acts very well. The fact was, Nick was a great voice actor and he had the technique down perfectly for making the dummy appear as if it were talking. But he just couldn't put together an interesting script, and that ruined his performances. Everything changed when the Wraith returned in its newest form a couple months later. Nick introduced his audiences to Tommy, the ventriloquist dummy he claimed to have discovered stashed away inside the depths of his basement. Nick played the role of a submissive character to the dummy, who subjected him to sharing with the audience embarrassing and controversial stories of their years spent together. It was a new kind of act, and quite different from the material he relied on previously, and it worked out great. The new content was engaging and funny, and it stood him out from his competitors. In a couple of weeks, he had gone from being a local bar performer to a local sensation. I knew the first time I saw him perform with Tommy in person that something was wrong with the dummy. I wasn't the only one who felt that way, either. My friends shared my suspicions. My fear was all but confirmed after we visited Nick in person after one show. When I looked into the dummy's dead white eyes, I sensed something staring back at me. I felt the same way I did when I played our unfinished game, and the way I felt being around the possessed portraits. Nick patiently explained that we were silly to be worried about him. The dummy wasn't possessed or haunted, he said with a chuckle. He'd convinced himself everything that happened with George was a result of a mental health crisis, and the Wraith never really existed in the first place. The more we pushed him, the more irritable he became. He laughed at us. He called us crazy and claimed we were jealous of his success. He told us we were all pathetic, and then threatened to stop speaking to us if we didn't drop the issue. We were still arguing with one another about how to get him to see sense when an unexpected opportunity presented itself. A few weeks later, Nick asked me to review a new act he was working on. I was the only one on good terms with him at the time, but I managed to convince Nick to allow his friends to come over so they could apologize to him in person for the previous fight. The three of us had agreed to try something more radical. When we came over to visit, Matthew and Hayden. Once they'd both convinced Nick of their remorse, we asked to see his newest act and he settled in to show it to us. The moment he got the dummy out, we sprung into action. His reaction was comical. He refused to give up on his act as we tried to snatch Tommy out of his hands. The dummy begged him for help as we tried to wrestle it away from him. It started laughing as he chased us through the house, its jaw swinging up and down as Nick ran after us. Nick was making the hysterical laughing sound and yet simultaneously wore a completely horrified expression on his face. Once we'd made our escape, we smashed it into pieces with a hammer and threw the remains into the trash. The very next day, Nick was back on stage with the same dummy, which didn't have a scratch on it, acting like nothing had happened. He refused to speak to any of us again after that. We returned to researching the origins of the entity, hoping to find a way to get rid of the source of our problems. I won't get into this much because it was a futile exercise. When we asked for help online, the responses we got ranged from disbelieving to making fun of us. We talked to two people who claimed they could help us, but they both turned out to be trolls. That was about the extent of it. The Wraith was manipulating Nick, I suspected. It gave him a taste of fame and success like he'd never experienced before and got him drunk on it. He quickly became dependent on the dummy since he couldn't perform without it. Over time, Nick's performances became increasingly disturbing and provocative. I continued to see them sporadically after our fallout, still convinced I could somehow get through to him. They were difficult to sit through. He knew certain things about the audience, who he frequently interacted with. The interactions he shared with people left many uncomfortable or offended. Others were entertained by his uncanny abilities and provocative personality. I saw people who were in hysterics after watching his performances and talked to others who were religious, fanatic fans of his. As its grip over his mind tightened, Nick began to talk to the dummy outside of shows. This was first spotted by his family, but it became obvious to everyone else around him in time. He had begun taking it with him wherever he went. Near the end, his brother claimed he never saw Nick without Tommy latched onto him. It had become his permanent companion, a part of him. This behavior didn't do wonders for his reputation, but by then he had accumulated a loyal band of followers who didn't care how eccentric and messed up he acted. The Wraith gave him the success he'd dreamed of since he was a child, but it did so at an unspeakable price. As for what happened to Nick, we never figured out a way to help him. The last place he was ever seen was somewhere strange called the Grand Circus of Mysteries. He worked there for a while as one of the star performers before inexplicably disappearing off the face of the earth following a particularly disturbed act. The dummy left with him, but I had no doubt the thing living inside it was still lurking out there somewhere. I lost track of the entity for a while after it had finished with Nick. I assumed it had gone on to haunt somebody else's life. Personally, I wanted nothing more to do with it. My remaining moved out of town, and I soon lost contact with them. I think we all felt responsible for failing Nick, and we saw each other as reminders of this failure. It was better for all of us if we put the past behind us and moved on with our separate lives. I was watching the news one day, some years later. The anchor began discussing a sinkhole which had appeared in a stretch of desolate plains outside of my hometown. They described it as a black hole in the ground which sucked in all the light from around it. I visited the place in person a couple days later. By then, half the people in town had gone over to take a look. I approached close enough to lean over and look down into the depths of the cave. When I gazed into the abyss, I felt something deep within staring back up at me. There, I fell into a kind of daze. I felt as if I were falling into the blackness. The world around me became unreal and distant. My wife, who'd gone out there with me, claimed I stood over the hole for over a minute, swaying slightly as I stared down into it. It was her who broke me out of my trance. She had to slap me several times before I returned to my senses. By then I was leaning over far enough that she swore I was about to fall in. I've been keeping track of the sinkhole since I visited it. I heard a group of kids dared someone to venture inside shortly after I went there. Jeff, I believe his name was. He reappeared a couple of days later with no recollection of having gone missing. I saw an older version of this boy in the news the other day, nearly 10 years later. After I heard about what he did, I figured it was time for me to finally get this story out there. I'm guessing the wraith has moved on from him by now. Perhaps it returned to the sinkhole, or maybe it has attached itself to a new conduit. Wherever it is, I don't doubt it is searching for another victim. Stay safe out there.